it seems to be a concept that students often find challenging to get their head around because the NAIRU is an unobservable variable. It's not something that we can actually see. And after she said this to me, it kind of got me thinking about my own experiences in first learning about the NAIRU during the HSC a long time ago. So Mrs. Podmore, who was a phenomenal teacher and a big part of the reason why I'm here today, was at the front of the class teaching us about all these new and exciting concepts like aggregate demand, inflation, and the Phillips curve. But then she introduces this concept of the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or the NAIRU. And that the RBA and the fiscal authorities pay very close attention to what this NAIRU is doing. And as a student, I remember thinking, but wait, if this thing's unobservable, how can the RBA possibly take it into account when it's making its monetary policy decisions? And it was really one of the, I think, the outstanding questions that I had coming out of the HSC. And even to this day, I still find it a challenging concept. And even experienced economists can define the NAIRU in different ways. And they often argue over what causes it to change and how relevant it is as a kind of barometer of spare capacity in the labour market. And so, yeah, I can certainly appreciate how challenging it would be to teach students about this. So what I wanted to do today is to give you an overview of how we think about the NAIRU at the bank. So I'll start off by talking a little bit about the concept of spare capacity and why that's important. And then I'll use that to ease into a discussion about how we use the NAIRU as a measure of spare capacity at the bank and some issues related to that. So the starting point is really this notion of spare capacity. And this is a concept that central banks like the RBA think a lot about and talk a lot about. So, for example, if you look at our recent statement on monetary policy, you'll see that we mention spare capacity 45 times. Now, spare capacity is all about the balance between demand and supply in the economy. So on the one hand, you have the aggregate demand for goods and services, which can be from households, businesses, and governments. And on the other side, you have the economy's ability to actually supply and produce those goods and services. Now, if we find ourselves in a situation where the aggregate demand for goods and services falls short of the economy's ability to actually supply them, then we say that there is spare capacity. But on the flip side, if there's too much aggregate demand relative to the economy's ability to supply it, we say there is no spare capacity. And one of the reasons that the bank cares so much about spare capacity is because if there is no spare capacity, so if the economy is booming and there's lots of demand, it's going to lead workers to seek higher wages, and it's going to lead firms to raise their prices. And so I'll kind of talk a little bit more about this in a second, but the key thing to note at this stage is that spare capacity matters for inflation. And as you know, the RBA has an inflation target, and so we want to set monetary policy so that inflation averages 2 to 3% over the medium term. And so we need to keep a very close eye on what's happening with spare capacity. But it's also the case that reducing spare capacity, and in particular, reducing spare capacity in the labour market, is an end in itself. And that's because the bank also has a mandate to pursue full employment. And basically, full employment means that labour is being fully utilised, such that there are enough jobs for anyone who is looking for work and is able to work. Now, when the RBA are evaluating how much spare capacity there is in the labour market, we look at lots of different indicators, so tens, maybe even hundreds of different indicators. And a big job of the bank's economic analysis department is trying to stay on top of all these different indicators and coming to an assessment of what spare capacity is like at that point in time. But one of the key ones that we look at is the unemployment gap. Now, the unemployment gap is just the difference between the unemployment rate and the NAIRU. So on this graph here that you can see, I'm showing the actual unemployment rate that's produced by the Australian Bureau of Statistics on a monthly basis, which is the red line. And the blue line is the RBA's estimate of the NAIRU at each point in time. So you can see that the unemployment rate moves around a lot. It tends to increase very quickly when the economy enters recession. And then during the recovery phase, the unemployment rate kind of gradually falls. And if you look at the NAIRU, you can see that it also moves around a lot, but not to the same extent. So the NAIRU tends to evolve fairly gradually over time. And the reason for that is that, well, it's partly by assumption, but it's also because the NAIRU is influenced by longer run structural factors that tend to evolve very slowly over time. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those structural factors a little bit later. And so the unemployment gap is just the difference between these two lines. Now on this graph, the largest unemployment gap that you can see is during the early 1990s recession. And at that point, we had a very large positive unemployment gap. So as I think Guy just mentioned, during that recession, aggregate demand fell very sharply. And a lot of people who wanted to work and were available to work weren't able to find a job. And so at that point in time, there was a lot of spare capacity in the labour market and we were very far away from full employment. And as a result, there was downward pressure on wage growth and inflation. But on this graph, you can also see a period where the unemployment gap was estimated to be negative. So where the unemployment rate actually fell below our estimate of the NAIRU. And that was in the mid-2000s, in the midst of the mining boom that we had. Now, during that period, the labour market was extremely tight. And as a result, wage growth and inflation both started to pick up very strongly. And some parts of the economy were showing signs of overheating. On this graph, you can also see some periods in time where the unemployment rate was very close to the NAIRU. So, around the period of 2011-12, the unemployment rate was close to the NAIRU. And so it's during these periods that people could reasonably argue that we were fairly close to full employment in the labour market. And when the economy is at that point, so when the unemployment rate is close to the NAIRU, there's no material upward or downward pressure on inflation. And inflation is just tracking along at a rate that's consistent with the RBA's 2 to 3% target. Now, so for that reason, you can kind of think of the NAIRU as a benchmark for assessing the degree of spare capacity in the labour market and for assessing the extent of inflationary pressure in the Australian economy. But of course, the big challenge is that we don't actually observe the NAIRU, and I'll come back to that issue in a second. So I was just talking about the relationship between the unemployment gap and inflation. And the framework that we use to think about that relationship is known as the Phillips Curve. And the Phillips Curve is really one of the most important macroeconomic relationships that the RBA thinks about when it's making its monetary policy decisions. It's really at the heart of monetary policy. When your students open up their textbooks and flick to the section on the Phillips Curve, I'm sure what they see is a stylized depiction of what a kind of typical Phillips Curve might look like. And that's fine, but I guess today, to make this presentation hopefully a little more interesting, I thought that instead of showing a stylized depiction of a Phillips Curve from a textbook, I'd show you the actual Phillips Curve that the RBA actually uses to help forecast and model inflation in Australia, which is what you can see here. So what I want you to do is to imagine that we're in a kind of pre-pandemic world and say where the economy is at this point, which I've indicated with this gold dot here. Now, at this point, which is kind of roughly the point we thought we were tracking towards before COVID came along, the unemployment rate is at the NAIRU and inflation is running within the RBA's 2 to 3% target range. Now, say completely for argument's sake, the RBA decides that instead of keeping unemployment at the NAIRU, it wants to drive the unemployment rate well below the NAIRU. And so to do that, it has a few options. It can either cut the cash rate target, or it can implement some of the unconventional monetary policy measures that Andrea was talking to you about before lunch. And what that does is it stimulates aggregate demand in the economy and reduces spare capacity in the labor market. And so from the framework of the Phillips curve, what happens is that the economy moves along the short run Phillips curve from this gold dot to the blue dot. And so in the short run, the bank succeeds in getting more people into work, but at the cost of a higher rate of inflation. And the kind of mechanism here is that as spare capacity in the labor market diminishes, businesses find it a lot harder to attract and retain the kind of workers that they need for their production. And so they need to offer them higher wages. And then they end up passing those higher wage costs on in the form of higher prices. Now, you can see in this purely hypothetical example that the unemployment rate drops to about 2% and the inflation rate increases to 6%, which kind of exemplifies the trade-off between unemployment and inflation that a central bank faces. But it's also important to realize that this is really only what happens in the short run, and that we can't stay at this blue dot forever. And that's because what happens is that workers see that inflation is rising more strongly than it had previously. And initially they were surprised about that increase in inflation, but eventually they're going to start revising their expectations of what inflation will be like in the future. Now, when they do that, they're going to demand higher wages from firms in order to compensate them for that higher inflation. And so when firms pay those higher wages, their costs go up and they're going to cut back on the number of people that they employ. And so what happens is that the Phillips curve shifts to the right, and we end up at this orange dot here, where the unemployment rate is back to the NAIRU and inflation has stabilized at a higher level than what it was at previously. Now, if you keep applying this logic, what it means is that in the long run, there is actually no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And if the RBA tries to exploit this short-run Phillips curve relationship, the only thing that will happen is we'll end up with higher inflation. And so for that reason, you can see that the long-run Phillips curve is just a vertical line. Now, this framework has really important implications for monetary policy, because what it suggests is that monetary policy is able to influence fluctuations of the unemployment rate around the NAIRU in the short run. But in the long run, it can't affect the level of unemployment. If policymakers want to lower the long run level of unemployment, monetary policy is not the right tool for that. And rather you need things like microeconomic reform and other policies that really target the kind of structural factors that that kind of determine the level of the NAIRU in the economy. Okay, so hopefully by now you've got a good sense of why the NAIRU is an important variable for the RBA to think about. But it's also important to appreciate that the NAIRU isn't actually something that we can observe. And to think about that, it's helpful to think about Well, it's helpful to compare the NAIRU to other things that we can observe, like the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. So to measure the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, it's really easy. We can just go to abs.gov.au, go to the labour force survey page, or go to the consumer price index page and download spreadsheets with all the data that you need to draw a graph like this. That's not the case for the NAIRU. So the ABS don't produce data on the NAIRU because the NAIRU is not something you can actually measure. But I guess that begs the question, if you can't measure the NAIRU, how did I show a graph of the NAIRU before? And I guess the key thing to note here is that even though we can't measure the NAIRU, we can infer how far above or below the NAIRU we are at a particular point in time by looking at things that we can observe and making inferences about the NAIRU. So, for example, if we observe that the unemployment rate is declining gradually over time, and then we get to a point where wage growth and inflation starts to increase materially, then we could infer with a bit of caution that we've either reached the NAIRU or perhaps even gone below the NAIRU. And a good example is the one I just discussed earlier, which was the mid-2000s mining boom. And what we observed over that period was the unemployment rate had been tracking lower for a long period of time. And eventually we got to a point where inflation really started to pick up. And so it's kind of reasonable from just eyeballing these data that we'd gone below the NAIRU at that particular point in time. On the other hand, if you think about the period, well, if you think about the situation that we were in immediately before the pandemic, what we'd observed is that wage growth and inflationary pressure was quite subdued. And so it's reasonable to infer, based on those data that we're seeing at the time, that we were probably above the NAIRU. The unemployment rate was probably above the NAIRU at that point in time. So the most basic way to infer the NAIRU is to simply look at what's happening to the unemployment rate, wage growth, and inflation. But the way that the bank does it is a little bit more sophisticated than that. Basically, we use a range of statistical models to estimate where the NAIRU is. And so what we do is we go and get data on inflation, wage growth, the unemployment rate, and some other variables. And then we make assumptions about the precise way in which all of those different variables relate to the NAIRU. And that process of model building requires lots of decision-making, lots of judgment, lots of assumptions. But thankfully, we have economic theory and academic research to guide us in that process of building those models. So once we have the model, we estimate it using the data that we have, and it spits out an estimate of where it thinks the NAIRU is. And before the pandemic, these models were telling us that the NAIRU for Australia was below 5%, so somewhere around 4.5%. But I should say that even though we have some fancy models for estimating the NAIRU, there's a lot of uncertainty in estimating where the NAIRU actually is. Now, one source of uncertainty is that our estimates of the NAIRU can get revised over time. So basically, as new data on unemployment, wages, and inflation come in, it can change our estimate of, well, it can change our latest estimate of the NAIRU, but it can also change our estimate of the NAIRU in the recent past. And so what you can see here is a graph that I stole from a speech that Lucy Ellis gave back in 2019. And what it shows is that in 2017, our model was telling us that the NAIRU was around about 5%. But then what happened subsequently is that the new data on wage growth and unemployment and inflation that we received showed that wage growth and inflation were coming in lower than we would have expected based on historical relationships. And so the model eventually updated its thinking on where the NAIRU actually was. Kind of, loosely speaking, it said, well, if wage growth has been this low, then it must be the case that we were further above the NAIRU than we initially thought. And so it's kind of revised its estimate of the NAIRU lower. And so one of the things this graph really emphasizes is that as the central bank, we need to be careful about over-interpreting the most recent estimate of the NAIRU, because there's a high likelihood that it could get revised over time. And there are lots of other uncertainties as well in estimating the NAIRU. And if you're interested in all this, I definitely recommend looking at Lucy Ellis's speech that I mentioned earlier. It's available on the RBA's website, and the title of it is Watching the Invisibles. Okay, so far I've spoken about the NAIRU, what it is and how we estimate it, but I haven't really said much about what causes it to change over time. And if you can remember back to the very first graph I showed you, it suggested that the NAIRU has been gradually declining over the past 3 decades. And it's important and interesting to think about why that might have happened. Now, the first thing to note is that the statistical models that we use to estimate the NAIRU don't actually tell us why the NAIRU has changed over time. They only tell us that the NAIRU has declined over time. So it doesn't give us the answer as to why this has happened. And so if we want to unpick some explanations for why the NAIRU has declined, we really need to draw on some other sources of information. So one of the things that we can look at that's helpful here is data on the composition of unemployment. And the kind of basic idea here is that you can think of the NAIRU as being the unemployment rate that would prevail if there's no spare capacity in the labour market, and when inflation is sustainably at the RBA's 2 to 3% target. So in other words, when you're at the NAIRU, there should be no cyclical unemployment. But of course, there will always be some frictional and some structural unemployment. So of course, there will always be some frictional unemployment in the labour market, because as the economy grows and as industries change and firms grow and contract, there will always be some people who are between jobs for a short space of time. And while the ABS don't produce estimates of frictional unemployment, they do publish data on the short-term unemployment rate. So in this case, in this graph, that's the share of the workforce who are unemployed for less than 4 weeks. And it's reasonable to think that the short-term unemployment rate is very close to the concept of frictional unemployment. And what you can see on the graph, if you squint hard enough, is that short-term unemployment has gradually fallen since the mid-90s. And this suggests that part of the reason why the NAIRU has declined is because frictional unemployment has declined. And one of the possible stories here is that the advent of the internet, apps like LinkedIn and websites like Seek and Indeed have made it easier for firms to find suitable workers and for unemployed people to find a suitable job. And so to the extent that firms and workers are kind of matching together quicker than they were in the past, then that means that at any given point in time, fewer people will be in frictional unemployment. So that's kind of part of the story, we think. But you also need to think about structural unemployment. And again, the ABS doesn't really produce a measure of structural unemployment. But when you think about structural unemployed and who they are, it's basically people who can't find any kind of job at the current market wage. And that could be because they don't have the right kind of skills that employers are looking for, or they might have a disability or some other characteristic that makes it hard for them to find a job. So what we tend to look at in terms of thinking about structural unemployment are people who have been unemployed for a very long period of time. So in terms of this graph, it's people who have been unemployed for more than a year. And what we can see from the orange line on this graph is that long-term unemployment has declined a lot since the early 90s, especially in the period leading up to the global financial crisis. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly why that's happened, but there are some candidate explanations that make a lot of sense. So one of those is a concept that economists refer to as hysteresis or scarring. And the basic idea here is that structural unemployment rose a lot during the early 90s recession because that was a very deep and very protracted recession. And so, if you were a person who lost their job during that recession, initially you were in cyclical unemployment. But if you're in cyclical unemployment for a long enough period of time, then eventually you might become structurally unemployed. And this could be because over time, you gradually lost the skills that you had, which makes it harder to find a job, or that, even if you hadn't lost those skills, firms might just assume that you've lost those skills. And so they're less likely to give you an opportunity. But then what looks to have happened is that over time, as the labor market tightened and we went through an unprecedented economic expansion, employers became more and more likely to hire workers that they previously might have considered less desirable. And so some people who'd been structurally unemployed were given a chance. They were given a job which gave them the opportunity to develop the skills and experience that they needed in order to improve their future employment prospects. And so that could also be part of the story for why the NAIRU has declined over time.